Okay, continuing this is a reminder chapters. We're going to do a very quick run through of taxonomy, classification systems. The caption up here goes, think about it, Ed. The class Insecta contains 26 orders, almost 1,000 families, and over 750,000 described species. I think that's up to 1 million now. But I can't shake the feeling we're all just a bunch of bugs. Classification levels, kind of finalized by Linnaeus. Although the domains are new. And the names, they haven't completely settled on the names. Bacteria is often called Monera or eubacteria. The archaea is pretty settled. And then we've got, let me get my pointer. So we've got 3 domains, maybe. Latest stuff I read is there's possibility of those 2 going together because they're finding connections between these 2 they didn't know existed. But below the domain, you have the smaller kingdom, you have the smaller phylum, you have the smaller class, you have the smaller order, you have the smaller family, you have the smaller genus, and then the species. Now, this one, notice the species is italicized and the genus is italicized, but the other groups are not. It's one of the weird rules about species names. And I do expect you to remember the rules about species names. 2 words. First word is the genus. It's considered foreign in English, so it should be written like a foreign phrase would be written in italics, underlined if you're writing longhand. These are all Latin also. I don't know why the rules, sometimes people apply the rules to the other groups and sometimes they don't. But the set rule is that the species and therefore the genus are considered to be foreign words. The second word of the species name's never ever capitalized. No matter, even if you name it after a person or after a place, it's never capitalized. And it doesn't mean anything on its own. The species name are those 2 words together. And if you want to abbreviate it, you put P partus. You take the genus and you abbreviate it to the first initial, like E. coli, C. elegans. And then you've got these bigger groups. Now remember, groups can be split into subgroups. So for a class, you could have a smaller subclass. They could be merged into supergroups. For a bigger class, you would have a superclass there. You could have a subphylum, you could have a subfamily, you could have a superfamily. It's a way to mess with the system without having to bump everything up and down the ladder. You can connect things that you think need to be connected. And that's the other part of this. This is all naming. People are going to disagree about this a lot. And the basic rule is if you think that a group needs to be a suborder rather than an order, and then 2 things need to be combined, or it needs to be a superfamily, and then these 2 things need to come in as families, you can do that. You can declare it however you want. Nobody else is necessarily going to go along with it. You're not allowed to change the name that was given to the group, though. That's how people know what you're talking about. So if you decided that carnivora should be a suborder, as long as you call it carnivora, people still know what's in that group. They know what you're talking about. So those are the basic rules of taxonomy. Species. Right now, the species concept seems to be under revision, and they're working out a genetics component to, what belongs in a species, what doesn't belong in a species. And again, how different does this population have to be from that population on a genetic standpoint, considering that you're just taking like 1 or 2 samples from each to compare them, a little iffy. But right now, almost all of the arguments about is it a species, is it a subspecies, who's related to whom, is almost all worked out genetically. It's all sequencing and comparing particular agreed, not the whole genome most of the time, but certain pieces of the genome. The trees that people build, the classic tree, where a branch is an ancestral population. That's a systematics approach. Most of the modern trees, the branches have to do with certain characteristic features appear in one group that didn't appear in the other group, and that's cladistics. There's an offshoot called phyllocode, which I think is dying, as it never did really catch on. And how this is going to change when genetics starts to get applied. I haven't seen people have basically been rewriting cladograms based on genetic information. Remember, you're looking at comparisons of features most of the time. You need to remember the idea that analogous features basically function the same way. So wings are analogous no matter who's got the wings. Butterfly's wings and an airplane's wings are analogous, but they're not homologous. Homologous structures are built with the same underlying pattern. So a bat's wing is more homologous to our hand than it is to a bird's wing. It's not built the same way that a bird's wing is. Definitely not built the same way that a butterfly's wing is. Whereas the relationship between us and bats, where our skin is built the same way, we have hair, is that structurally we're much more similar. Is that, yeah, we don't have wings, but their wings are actually more homologous to our hand than they are to a bird's wings. So homology is really the comparison. And that's what's happening with molecules too. When you're comparing DNA sequences, you're comparing the homology of two molecules. They used to compare amino acid sequences and proteins when they could do that, and hadn't really gotten the technology to compare DNA. DNA is pretty much it now. Okay, a couple of terms that we probably didn't have before. I'm not going to write them down. You're going to have to follow along. You're looking at wings in bats. And it's the classic question that's been around forever. I'm actually going to turn this off. I just replaced a couple of bulbs. I'm getting a little antsy about bulbs. You got the macro bats and the micro bats. Do they belong in the same group? Typically, the answer is, if you trace them back to their shared ancestor, would that ancestor be classified as a bat? Typically, the wings are the cladistical trait, and the sort of question is, did that ancestor have wings? If not, then wings arose separately on these two branches. If the wings go back to the shared ancestor, the wings are considered an ancestral trait. That's the term you want to remember. You want to write that down. If they arose separately in two groups, they developed wings along the way, but their ancestor didn't have wings, then wings are considered a derived characteristic, is that they both came up with them kind of on their own. Another thing is that all of the members of the group should be members of the group, duh. That's considered to be a monophyletic group. But if you think that the group doesn't include, they don't share a common ancestor, then you consider that to be a polyphyletic group. Polyphyletic is a criticism. People that believe that the wings in those two back groups are derived don't believe that though they should be merged into a single order or superorder. Sometimes it's a superorder. They go, no, if you put those in an order together, that's a polyphyletic group. Which means that you've got two groups that shouldn't be in the same group. So, and then there's a weirder term, paraphyletic. Paraphyletic is where everybody kind of acknowledges that this group should be part of this group, but it branched off so dramatically, and it's been considered separate for so long, that the people are not comfortable combining them, although some people will. Great example of that, birds and dinosaurs, is that it's the way that we determine relationships. The bird should certainly be classified as dinosaurs, but they haven't been. Dinosaurs were supposed to have been extinct, no survivors. The birds were supposed to be a separate off group. We've since connected them to the the groups that got the raptors and the velociraptors and T-Rex and stuff in it. But to preserve that Birds are a separate group, dinosaurs are a separate group. People go, well, birds are a paraphyletic group. They're an offshoot that, yeah, probably should still be considered part of the main group, but they're so different, and they're still alive, where they're gonna be considered paraphyletic. So those are terms that there isn't a huge amount of taxonomic stuff being done now, but some of the more interesting papers you'll run into are taxonomic. And monophyletic, polyphyletic, and paraphyletic are good things just to know that. Remember, this is a language course. Those are good terms to have in your head, so when you run into them, you don't have to try to look them up. Because paraphyletic is not an easy thing. The definition of paraphyletic is a little weird. Is that I gave you kind of the Cliff's Notes version that's, I hope, more understandable. But even there, people don't necessarily agree on how paraphyletic should be applied as a term. Okay, as I said, this is a quick review of basic concepts. That's it for chapter 2 and section 2.